you can't really have a government that says it's committed to having a country that is diverse and, having a government that is reflective of that diversity, and then also champion this very outdated, old-fashioned idea that Canada is fundamentally a country of two founding nations, only two, the French and the English, and that those communities sort of will forever be able to dictate the shape and nature of the country.
One of my biggest critiques of the mainstream media in Canada is the bland sameness of all the political commentators, columnists, pundits, panelists, and thought leaders. Regardless of what station you tune into, what paper they write for, or what party they claim to come from, there is a rigid, boring repetitiveness being spout from our country's Laurentian elites, who always more or less agree on things, despite claiming to represent the broad political spectrum in Canada. My guest on the True North Speaker series breaks that mold, and often defiantly leads the conversation in totally new and interesting ways. J.J. McCullough is a Vancouver-based political commentator, cartoonist, YouTuber, and columnist with the prestigious Washington Post. J.J.'s columns often trigger an incredible and disproportionate response from his critics, who seem to resent the very fact that he has a large platform and a huge audience to share his contrarian views with. I don't always agree with J.J., but I always appreciate his unique perspective and the ideas he brings to the table. In our conversation today, we take a deep dive into Canadian politics, assessing the current parliament, the party leaders, and we talk about why the fringe left-wing parties are given more airtime and more credibility from the mainstream media versus the upstart right-of-center People's Party. We also get into Canada's history. We discuss Pierre Trudeau's 1969 white papers that sought to abolish the separate system of governance for Canada's Indigenous people. We discuss individual versus collective rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Charlottetown Accord, and we dissect and challenge the accusation that Canada is a systemically racist country. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and leave me a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to True North, and if you'd like to support this podcast, please visit tnc.news/donate. I'm joined by J.J. McCullough. J.J., thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
I never know what you're going to look like. I feel like your hairstyle changes like so much every time. So I also feel like your hair grows really fast. I don't know if that's just like the power of YouTube, where I see one video and you've got like short blonde hair, and then the very next video you've got this big long flow.
I just get bored with hair really easily. And I'm lucky because my mother's a hairdresser, so any crazy thing I want done to my hair, I can usually get done that weekend. So
very cool. Well, you're lucky because during COVID, I couldn't get a haircut like to save my life. I was in Toronto and like everything was closed. And then when salons finally opened, the salon I go to was booked out for like 4 months. So I could get an appointment, and I was envious of anyone who had a haircut.
Geez, the struggle is real.
Yeah, I know. First world problems, right? So we just very narrowly avoided an election last week. And I know you were very on top of it and commenting. So why don't you walk us through what happened and what you think should have happened with Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, and the whole confidence vote there?
Well, I mean, I thought that it was a real sort of low point in the history of the politics of this country, and certainly the history of the Trudeau administration. Because you basically had the WE scandal, this sort of the allegation that Justin Trudeau had, basically the allegation is that he has essentially rigged a government contract to help this WE charity that we know that he himself and his various family members had benefited materially from, that they'd been given jobs and commission work and that kind of thing for this organization. And I had really sort of felt like that the half-life of this story was over, that it was sort of fading into the distance. But, the Conservatives have really continued to hammer on and hammer on and hammer on this, wanting to know all of the facts, all of the details, who got paid when and who knew what when and all this kind of thing. Pierre Poilievre and leading the charge in the House of Commons day after day after day. And then so it sort of culminated in this idea that they were going to get the Parliament to vote on forming a official parliamentary committee to continue to examine the WE scandal and all of its magnitudes. And and this sort of came to a vote in the House of Commons, and the Liberal Party declared that any vote on this matter was going to be a matter of confidence, which meant that if the parties voted in favor of it, then essentially this would be sort of taken as a sign that the House of Commons had no confidence in the governing party, and that therefore the Parliament should be dissolved and we should be plunged into a national election. And I think just a lot of people, myself included, just it struck as just so brazenly cynical, like that there was no pretense of any sort of higher principle of good governance at play here. It was simply just a matter of that the conservatives, were trying to look into something, were trying to look into some embarrassing business on the part of the government, and the government just didn't care for this to happen, and therefore we're going to just pull out the big guns and prevent it from happening. But in some respects, I think the big story here, because of course we know we're not in an election, so clearly the vote was voted down. But the key variable was the NDP, right? Because we know that the Conservatives can't muscle things through on their own. They need the support of at least one other party. And I think there was a lot of expectation that it would be the NDP, if anyone, that was going to, it's not even mysterious. It had to be the NDP. That was just basically how the math worked. And the NDP always talks a good game. People like Charlie Angus, who have been really sort of bloviating loudly about the Wee scandal and, giving as good as the Conservatives in some respects. But, when sort of push came to shove, they weren't willing to support the creation of this committee. They weren't willing to sort of call Trudeau's bluff and challenge his premise that this was a confidence vote. He sort of backed down at the last minute, Jagmeet Singh did. And I think that just reflects very poorly on the NDP and sort of has made a lot of people realize that the NDP is fundamentally a coalition partner of the Liberal government. The NDP exists to keep the Liberal Party in power, to keep the Liberal government propped up. And there's not really any pretense otherwise. Like, they can talk a good game all they want, but fundamentally, the most important question in Canadian politics is who is running the country? What party is running the country? And the NDP, whenever it's challenged, and this goes back to Jack Layton and all the other sort of previous NDP bosses, whenever that central premise of Canadian politics is challenged, who should be running the country, the NDP, or sorry, the Liberal Party or somebody else, the NDP always sides with the answer being the Liberal Party.
Well, it seems to me that it's the only way that the NDP could have any sort of power in the country. One of the striking things from my perspective about what was going on with all the jostling of the parties was just how brazenly sort of political it was. That there was no, like you said, pretense of like doing anything moral or doing what's right for the country. It's like, Trudeau was going to go to great length to avoid having a committee examine whatever happened with We, and the NDP is like the power broker. And, if they forced an election, then they might not be the power broker anymore because there could be a majority government or the Conservatives could win, and then they wouldn't fit into that sort of coalition. I always wonder if Canadians sort of see through it and have become like cynical like me, or if they just believe that, the parties that they like are doing the right thing because, maybe having an election during COVID would make us all die or something.
Well, it's no, you raise a lot of good points. I mean, as a British Columbian, it's particularly rich when the NDP is using this line about an election during COVID, because of course here in British Columbia, our NDP government called an election in the middle of our supposed second wave here in BC. And not only that, but Jagmeet Singh himself has been tromping all around the province, campaigning for the NDP government of British Columbia. Jagmeet Singh is now sort of reimagined that he's a British Columbian because, he parachuted in here last year to win an easy seat so he could get in the House of Commons. So it's just, the NDP has had to do a lot of damage control about this, because they feel very against the wall, because I think a lot of their base is kind of cheesed off at them as well, that that this party exists to constantly just prop up the Liberal government and exchange for what exactly, right? That they can imagine themselves as being, the power broker and maybe getting a tiny little tweak to the CERB program or something like that here and there. But it's pretty small beans, right? If the NDP really believes that the Liberal Party is wrong for the country and should not be in government, then they have to be able to sort of make a stronger case to that regard. They have to be able to drive a harder deal. And that means being willing to, push them out of power when that opportunity presents. But the other level of cynicism is, of course, that we look at the polls and we see, the NDP isn't doing so hot with voters right now. Their poll numbers are not great, and it gets even deeper because then people are saying like, well, the NDP doesn't have a lot of money right now, as if they ever do, and like they're thus not in a good position to fight the election and this sort of thing. So I mean, it is in some respects like I would hope that the average Canadian is aware of this because it does sort of show that our whole sort of political system, this whole parliamentary system is so twisted in some level, and it is all just based on partisan calculation and nothing else. Like this whole idea of like a confidence vote, right? Like it was like I don't know, like a century ago, maybe that meant something as like an idea of how our government structure is sort of worked out, and like the confidence of the parliament actually meant something in terms of determining like who deserves to be prime minister in some sort of more holistic sense. But now it means nothing. Like it's all of these sorts of things. Confidence of the House, when we have elections or don't have elections, the formation of committees, like all of this stuff is now subordinate to partisan calculation. And it's not great. It's not healthy for democracy at all. And I hope that Canadians are starting to wise up to that, because we are, as you said, like we just are living in a system in which there is no higher principle governing anything.
I often wondered that about question period itself, like having this sort of like, almost rote, conservatives ask a question and then Trudeau stands up and like reads something off a piece of paper, like half-heartedly, or like, he deflects a question. It's like, what's the point of this? I understand that it's part of the tradition. I think it's good. Maybe at one point in Canada's history, they would actually have debates. They would actually listen to each other and then respond to the point. But, what we see today is just very robotic. It's like, the prime minister knows what the question is, or he doesn't listen to the question and he just reads off talking points that someone read to him. It's like, how is this actually getting to the bottom of things? Like, is this really holding a prime minister to account, just having him stand up and like state rehearsed lines? Like, how is this democracy? I don't know.
No, exactly. You make such an excellent point, right? It's like there's so much of sort of Canadian politics that it's just this like theater and yeah, just like going through the motions of these like increasingly like ritualistic ceremonial kind of activities that really like they're fun, I guess, for people that live in Ottawa. Like the professional politicians, they sort of want to go through the motions of feeling important and feeling like they're playing the game of being a politician. But at the end of the day, when it comes to issues that matter, they're not consequential at all. Although I will say that one thing that I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by was when Prime Minister Trudeau was called before I don't recall what committee it was specifically, but he was, of course, called before that one committee. I think it was like a finance committee to testify about what he knew about the WE scandal. And Pierre Poilievre really gave him an intense grilling. And in that context, you could see something resembling parliamentary accountability take place because it wasn't scripted. The Prime Minister didn't know the questions ahead of time. The Prime Minister was sort of really on the hot seat, and it was a very focused line of questioning in the context of a very specific sort of committee in which like it was searching for it was sort of like a trial, right? Like that they were searching for like clear objective information to help the committee determine conclusions about things, as opposed to sort of the partisan spectacle of question period, which is so sort of ceremonial and just sort of gummed up with all of this sort of empty, rote, scripted partisan talking points. And that the point of that is that makes the fact that we're not having this committee to look into the WE scandal sort of all the more disappointing, because independent of like all of this stuff about the election and whether or not we're going to have one and yada, 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 it is also just, it's sad because like now this committee is not going to be formed. And so our ability to actually do that kind of deep dive into the WE scandal has now evaporated thanks to the NDP, and we'll be off to the next thing. And so I suppose the sort of the cover won't be closed on this particular scandal in the way that we had wanted it to be, because ultimately, I mean, this is something else. This says something about our parliamentary system, is that the only real way that you can get like a true hard information from a government in this country is through some sort of parliamentary committee in the context of a minority government. Unless the stars all align in that perfect fashion, which only happens, like once every decade or so, you're basically not going to get any accountability, because we know that things like the ethics commissioner and all the rest of it are just, pointless figureheads as well. So it's really disappointing, and I hope the NDP is pleased with itself because they're the architects of this.
Well, you're pretty critical of the NDP. You're actually critical of all the parties in different ways. So I was hoping we could sort of go through each of the parties here, and you could offer your critique, because it's interesting. We'll start with the NDP since we were just talking about them. But Jagmeet Singh has this sort of star power. I think the media are really into him. He's this sort of woke, modern, sophisticated, urban elitist prototype. And that's the media's dream, right? Like when he first came on the scene, it's like, wow, he's like Justin Trudeau, except for he's like, from another culture, so that makes him even better. But then when it came to the election, he just totally sunk. Like it was pretty disastrous for the NDP, for all the consternation about Andrew Scheer and how he failed and how he didn't do what he was expected of him. It really was the NDP that went down all across the board in terms of seats, in terms of the vote representation. So why is it that Jagmeet gets sort of a free pass? Why is he still leading this party when you pointed out the party's broke, they bankrupted themselves basically, they lost all their seats in Quebec, they have very few seats. Sure, they hold the balance of power, but why do you think he avoids the sort of scrutiny that other political leaders get?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, and I mean I'll confess to my own guilt in this, is that I was somebody that was very sort of pumping up Singh's image when he sort of first sauntered onto the scene, because I did, and I think like a lot of media people did this, is I think we projected sort of skills onto him that he just objectively didn't have. And I think that there was a sort of fascination with the idea that, he was a minority, he was from this minority faith, and that was going to give him some sort of traction in this sort of era of identity politics and that kind of thing. But then I think there was also just like a lot of fantasizing that, for example, he was a charismatic person, which I don't think he's charismatic. I think he's quite awkward in his manner of speaking, and that's something that a lot of people have pointed out to me. It's like, wow, Jagmeet Singh, like he just can't talk that well, can he? He's stumbling and bumbling his way through press conferences, like that. And he's also a man who just straight up does not seem like he has clear motivation for why he's in politics. He carries himself as someone that's just kind of been cast into this role, sort of almost against his wishes, and he's just trying to like figure out, tell me what to do, what do I have to do, what should an NDP leader be doing, as opposed to someone who has a sort of clear sense of why he's in politics and what his ultimate goal is in sort of playing this game. But this is a bigger problem with the NDP in general, is that it does, I think, have that kind of existential dread at its core, is that it doesn't really know what it exists to do. Because I think that I often wonder if there's ever been that much daylight between the NDP and the Liberals. I know that there's kind of this fantasy that there was some glory age in which the parties were very different and only now they've gotten very similar. But I think that when you look back through time, this is actually a more consistent criticism than some might expect. We know, for example, that Jack Layton was like constantly trying to make deals with the Liberal Party, even, prop up a Liberal minority government in order to keep the Conservatives out of power and all of this kind of thing. And I think that, that becomes a sort of existential crisis, because then it's like, well, why are you a separate party then? Like, do the people that are currently making up the NDP caucus, do they really have more power, more influence doing what they're doing now than they would if they were just a faction, perhaps a further left faction within the Liberal Party itself, in the same way that like the Democrats in the States, they have a further left faction, the AOC faction that exerts some influence within the party. And but the NDP has a culture, right? Like, and that's the thing. It's like the NDP is kind of like a culture that has a party, and it's kind of a culture of a certain clique of sort of far left people in our society. People associated increasingly just with sort of the public sector unions, and people in sort of public sector union adjacent, activist circles and professions and things like that. Academics, educators, social workers, and sort of bureaucrats of various stripes. And sort of like people within that orbit are very committed to the NDP because they've sort of grown up learning that the NDP is their party. My mother, for example, was a public school teacher, and I remember we would get like these magazines from the Public School Teachers Union here in BC in the mail every so often, and they'd always be full of like NDP propaganda. So it's kind of like really beaten into your head when you're sort of part of this NDP sort of milieu, that the NDP is the only party that's going to fight for you, and it's the only one that's looking out for these distinct interests of these distinct communities. And I think that part of that culture is that it makes people just not very critical, and it makes them not really ask a lot from their leaders. I think that when you look through the history of NDP leaders, not only federally but at the provincial level, is that they're given a lot of second and third and fourth choices, even in the face of clear signs that they're just like objectively not good at their job, that they're not good at winning elections, they're not good at winning seats. And I think that Jagmeet Singh is a classic example of that. Like, he clearly failed at his central job, which was to make the party do better, to make the party gain or at least hold what it already had. He didn't do that. And yet, because the NDP culture, I think, is just much more deferential to leaders, particularly leaders that have sort of like, proven their loyalty. Singh is, of course, a man who sort of rose up through the Ontario NDP, and so he's a good NDP man. It's revealing that the only NDP man who actually did get thrown under the bus was Thomas Mulcair, and that was because, he was somebody that sort of like the NDP true believers always had their doubts about, because, he came from a different party. He was a liberal, even flirted with the Conservatives, and, thus could not be sort of trusted. But no, I mean, like, this is just the kind of party that the NDP is. I think it's an unserious party run by unserious people that are sort of captive to a kind of fantasy of relevance that's never actually going to come true.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you talked about wondering Jagmeet's motivation for getting into politics. He did this weird video a while ago, like a long time ago, where he was talking about how his motivation for getting into politics was former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh because of his anti sort of Khalistani Sikh separatism position. And so it sort of feels like a leader that's so distracted by a very fringe foreign policy issue. And, there's video of him speaking at a Khalistani, which is a Sikh separatist movement in India, rally in San Francisco, where he keeps referring to India as our country. And so, it's just sort of weird, because if that happened, like, it came out during the last election that Andrew Scheer was a dual Canadian-American citizen. If there is ever footage of a conservative saying our country, talking about the United States, that would be the end of them. It sort of was the end of Michael Ignatieff when clips surfaced of him saying another country was our country. But for Jagmeet, that sort of flew under the radar. To me, the NDP was always a coalition of two different groups. It's like the sort of blue-collar union crowd, and then this sort of environmentalist urban crowd, which Jagmeet clearly fits into the latter. He has a Rolex collection and he has these fancy suits, and he just seems so out of place in the party. But the way you describe the culture, those sort of things mesh together because they're so sort of obsessed with the identity politics thing. Let's move on and talk about the Green Party, JJ, because you're probably one of the most outspoken people I've ever met about the Green Party. And, they have a new leader, Anime Paul, who sort of just positions herself as sort of yet another, they call themselves center left. I would call them like fringe far left, like party that's just focused on social justice and pushing identitarianism. Why don't you give us your overview?
My take on the Greens. Well, I mean, like, the Greens are basically like the party for whom the NDP is like not far left enough, right? Like, and not only that, it's important, like, to even clarify this further, because like the narrative of the Green Party is sort of that all of the parties are corrupt, all of the parties are indistinguishable, which is, a strange belief to have, and that therefore, like, you need to have this like pure, like, I don't know, fourth or fifth or sixth party. I don't know what rank we would put them in. But like, we need to have like this other party that is like so detached from the mainstream, right? Like, the Green Party is the party of people that really demonize the mainstream and everything that they perceive to be mainstream. The mainstream party system, but then also things like mainstream medicine, big business, mainstream, academia, like any sort of like force of authority that currently exists in Canadian society is dismissed as being, corrupt and sort of wicked and the tool of the capitalists and all the rest of it, and sometimes even more deranged people. And the thing that causes this, or sort of like the consequence of this, is that you have a party in which conspiracy theories really tend to thrive. The party really does seem like it is a breeding ground for people that have an inherently sort of conspiratorial view of the world, and it attracts these people in great numbers. And Elizabeth May, when she was leader of the Liberal Party, which she still may be in some sort of de facto capacity, did a lot of things during her, like, I don't know, 15-year tenure of the party in which she would sort of put out dog whistles suggesting that this party was sort of on the side of the conspiracy theorists. When it came to things like, reading a petition about the 9/11 truth in the House of Commons, like the idea that, like, we need to get to the bottom of this, right? She read a petition in the House of Commons sort of making that exact case. And we know that there's been 9/11 truther candidates that have run for the Green Party repeatedly. We know that there have been anti-Semitic candidates that have run for the Green Party repeatedly. The man who came in second place against Anime Paul, Dimitri Leskaris, like, he's a man who has been repeatedly accused of anti-Semitism, and at the very least is a man who has made an obsession with the state of Israel like the central focus of his political life. He is a man deeply, deeply obsessed with this idea of, like, the Zionist elite sort of doing all sorts of machinations to control everything. And this is a man that, came within quite close proximity of being the liberal leader instead of Anime Paul. You can go expand the thing further. Things like chemtrails. Elizabeth May has made supportive noises about that whole conspiracy theory. So I think that one of the problems about the way that we talk about the Green Party is that the Canadian media is really obsessed with the Green Party as this kind of story of, like, the plucky upstart. I don't know how many times in, like, the last 20 years I've read some story in a mainstream publication where it's like, Green Party eyes breakthrough in the next election, right? Like, there's always this kind of idea that the Green Party are kind of the lovable losers of Canadian politics, and they're just, like, too principled for their own good, and, like, oh shucks, they're going to give it their best, and maybe they're going to break through. And now that they've got 3 seats in the House of Commons, you see the press giving them, like, undue attention and sort of saying, well, how are the Greens going to vote in this confidence vote? Even though their votes are completely mathematically irrelevant, there's still this desire to believe that they are, like, a strong and important presence, motivated only by, like, their plucky underdogness. But what I say is that there is so much evidence that the Green Party has, like I said, been a breeding ground, or at least a sort of, like, welcoming environment for really, like, the fringe crackpot sort of set of Canadian society. And what exasperates me is just that the press has had no interest in sort of framing the party that way. Because the media, of course, has tremendous power. And part of the way that the media has power is how it chooses to create narratives around the political actors in this country. And I think the Canadian press is sort of, like, uniquely brazen about doing this, is that they tell you a certain story about a person, and then that story becomes the mainstream, right? So, for example, like, Andrew Scheer, the narrative about him was, kind of unassuming guy, didn't really have what it took, kind of scary, kind of religious kook. And, that's why he couldn't close the deal with the election, was because people were afraid of his extreme Christian views or whatever. So, like, you can go through the line and, like, there's little storylines about everybody. And the problem to me is just that the storyline about the Green Party, the sort of the plucky upstart storyline, is just, it's only true if you ignore so much else that we've seen and that I have done my best to document over the years. You can go to my website, operationtinfoil.com, and see a long, long list of crackpot things that the Green Party has done over the years.
Well, it's interesting because, with Elizabeth May, it was like the media just liked her. Like, she was friendly with them. They knew her. She was such a sort of known figure that they would give her so much attention and then say that she was media savvy. But it was like, she's media savvy because you're giving her
yes, exactly.
all this attention. Like, she's pretty crazy and not mainstream at all. I always wish that the Green Party would take more of, like, a free market approach and not just be like another far left party, but maybe be like a free market party that really supports a green agenda, environmentalist, like, not even environmentalist, but just conservation and a clean environment. And then at least we'd have some choice, when it comes to political parties. But I think you're right, as is the Greens are just really, really far left and irrelevant. Why do you think it is that these small fringe parties on the left get so much credibility and so much, spotlight from the press, treated like they're really, really important? Whereas, when you have something like the People's Party and Maxime Bernier, it's treated like it's a scary threat and it's somehow, this murky force that's here to, like, subvert Canadian freedom and democracy or something like that.
Well, I mean, it just goes to sort of, like, the storylines that the press sort of really clings to, right? And so, one of the storylines is that, the environment, like climate change and this kind of thing, matters a great deal and is, one of the defining sort of political challenges of our time. And that therefore a party that ostensibly professes to sort of care about something like that gets treated very seriously, like the Green Party. And so, like, a lot of the way that the Green Party is framed is not only that they're the plucky upstarts, but, they're the plucky upstarts that are motivated by this kind of like fashionable new cause in Canadian politics. And thus it is logical that there would be a Green Party because, of course, the stakes have never been higher and this sort of thing. And then whereas like something like the People's Party, that fits into this narrative that, all around the world, we're sort of seeing these like sort of pseudo-fascist, populist, far-right, racist, anti-immigration parties sort of rise up in order to cause chaos and are probably funded by Russian, disinformation campaigns and all this kind of thing, right? So like that's a very entrenched narrative as well. And it was just a matter of time before some sort of character came onto the scene that sort of fit that profile, that sort of media profile, sort of the confirmation bias, and could kind of be part of that storyline in the context of a Canadian sort of media narrative, in the same way that, Trump and Le Pen and, I guess even Brexit and like all these kinds of things around the world have sort of been slotted into that narrative. There was a desire to find out like who is going to be Canada's version of that. And so I think the People's Party sort of fit that bill nicely and was sort of framed as such. And I mean, like, I have a lot of problems with the People's Party. I have a lot of problems with Maxime Bernier. I think that he was just, I think that he lacks a lot of obvious political talent as well. But, I think it was always pretty obvious from the beginning that this was going to be treated as a sort of as just like an inherently sort of sinister force in Canadian politics, just because that's the storyline. We're all trapped in the storyline of the mainstream press in this country, and it's just a matter of like what role are we going to be assigned.
It's funny because I feel like everything that happens in Canadian media is framed to juxtapose Trump. So like the whole coronavirus thing, the media were obsessed with comparing Canada's reaction to the U.S. reaction, which, fundamentally, obviously there were some major differences, but at the end of the day, both countries got it pretty bad. And you can't really say that one was like, Trump handled it worse or Trudeau handled it worse or whatever. It was like, no one really knew what was going on. Everyone handled it poorly. Some people did some things better, but it'd be interesting to go through this sort of media history since Trump came on the scene and see all the different conservatives that have been compared to Trump and like, the fear mongering. I remember Kelly Leach when she was running for leader, they like superimposed Trump's hair onto her and said and then it was like Doug Ford was supposed to be Trump, but then like, he's pretty much governing like the liberal, then we had Andrew Scheer, Jason Kenney and Maxime Bernier. It's like the Canadian press just really want a Canadian Trump so that they can like spend years and years dunking on him like they do for the real Trump.
No, it's you're exactly right? Like that there is this idea that like the phenomenon has to occur, and so we will do whatever it takes to sort of like fit someone into this predetermined little storyline that we have. And of course, like, but it also becomes, there's also, of course, in Canada, there's this sort of other layer of narrative, which is like the righteousness of the good Canadian versus sort of the evil Americans. And thus, sort of like somebody like Bernier or Kelly Leach as well are useful because then the press can sort of frame them as like Canadians decisively rejected these sort of like sirens and their tempting sort of tales of, bad things. And like this is a reflection of sort of like the inherent morality and the inherent sort of progressivism of the Canadian people that can sort of never be escaped. And sort of like you challenge that at your own risk and this sort of thing, which sort of eliminates the possibility that somebody like Kelly Leach or somebody like Maxime Bernier were just like bad politicians, like that they were unsuccessful sort of in spite of their views on a number of issues, including immigration, rather than because of them, right? And that's sort of something that I think the Canadian press has a very hard time doing, is sort of dealing with those in spite of rather than because of sort of differences and distinctions. But there's always been this kind of idea, and you've seen a lot of sort of articles in the mainstream written about this, like the idea of like Canadians being like fundamentally immune to or allergic to the sort of populist rot that has sort of struck elsewhere in the world. And this goes back to it's just a very sort of standard idea that like Canadians are just fundamentally better people. I think that was literally like a headline that John Kay himself might have written at one point, which is just like, we're just kind of better people and that we're just not corrupted by these kinds of things. And I think this is a sort of a subtle way that the press can sort of put their finger on the scale when it comes to, sort of just presenting what kind of ideas get a fair shake versus what kind of ideas don't. Is that you sort of you mask a lot of things into this sort of under the cover of patriotism and what is sort of like the supposed inherent character of the Canadian people, because then it frames things where it's like, well, you want to be a good Canadian, don't you? Right? You want to think the things that only good Canadians think. You don't want to think the kind of things that bad, evil, sort of right-wing Americans think, do you? And then so you just kind of create this idea where certain ideas are framed as not only being sort of bad or sinister, but sort of fundamentally unpatriotic and unserious in that respect. And I think that this is an experience that a lot of sort of more conservative Canadians have had, is sort of being scolded as being like, well, why do you hate Canada? Why don't you just move to America and all this kind of stuff?
Right. Well, just wait for there to be like a far left government down in the U.S. and Canada will finally come to its senses and have conservatives, and then everyone will fail to understand like what's happening in the world again. It'll be like back to the Harper years. It's interesting, you know, what the media puts forth, because in order to agree with what you said about how Canadians reject populism and this like good Canadian narrative, it's like you have to ignore every poll you see on immigration or integration, which shows that Canadians are actually pretty traditionalist in terms of like wanting newcomers to become Canadian, wanting fewer immigrant. I think every poll I've ever seen wants like massive decreases in immigration. That's just something that the media completely ignore. I want to pick up on something you said, though. You basically said that the PPC and that Maxime Bernier, you know, isn't a very good politician. So I wonder what, you know, if you were advising Maxime Bernier, or if you were in charge of the People's Party, what would you have done differently? And do you think that there is a sort of piece on the political spectrum where they could potentially be like an important political party or political movement in Canada?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm generally not a big believer in the idea of making new parties. I suppose I'm more of a sort of entryist kind of sort of philosophy, which is to sort of say, like, if you have a perspective, it's sort of better to work within one of the existing sort of coalition parties, because ultimately, like, that's what's going to bring you to government, and it's the government that will ultimately make the policies that will sort of achieve the goals that you're purportedly interested in, right? And so, I mean, like, you could say that Bernier did what he should have done, in the sense that he ran to be head of the Conservative Party. I mean, you could say that he didn't run to be head of the Conservative Party on the agenda he would wind up championing as head of the People's Party. But, you know, he did what you would expect to do. And I think that what a lot of People's Party supporters should have been more concerned with is sort of trying to champion their perspectives within the context of the Conservative Party, and try to think about, like, how can we get a leader like that as the next head of the Conservatives? And it doesn't seem like there was any effort to do that in the most recent Conservative Party race, that there was no candidate representing that kind of more populist or sort of like immigration sort of restrictionist, or however you want to sort of frame it, that sort of faction of the Conservative Party and movement, which is very large and like prominent. And as you said, like, there is a lot of polling data to suggest that there is considerable appetite, and certainly considerable appetite on the right, for an agenda resembling that. And yet, you know, conservatives, that sort of faction of conservatives, did not mobilize behind a candidate that could champion in their cause, and thus were not really a force at all in the most recent Conservative leadership race. Instead, the Conservative Party has sort of, you know, gone back to its sort of traditional messaging on these issues. And so I think that this is, again, one of the problems when you have sort of these fringe parties, is that they sort of become, you know, sort of cordoned off, and become this sort of, it becomes a more sort of like overtly fringe cause, if you know what I mean. Because then you can say, well, like, oh, the only people that believe that kind of stuff, they're a part of the Maxime Bernier sort of personality cult. Like, they're not serious people. And I imagine that this probably happens to some degree when it comes to sort of some of the causes of the further left, right? Is that, you know, the Trudeau liberals or whatever can sort of say, oh, you know, that's just an NDP idea, or that's a Green Party idea. Like, these are fringe kind of things. And it goes back to what I was saying before, right? Like, strategic advice to the NDP, I think, would be for them to get rid of their party and just become a sort of further left faction within the Liberal Party, and perhaps exercise force in pushing the Liberal Party perhaps further to the left on the issues that they purport to care about. And I would give the same advice to people within the People's Party, is that if they truly want to have an influence, why don't they do the hard work of actually being a faction that can't be denied within the Conservative Party itself? And I think that a good role model in that regard would be some of the pro-life movement and the pro-life organization in this country, who I think have refused to go away and have been a stubbornly persistent faction within the Conservative Party. I've heard some people say that there's probably more overtly pro-life Conservative MPs than there have been in decades. And that's a testament to how dedicated the pro-life movement in this country has been to working within the party structure, as opposed to, you could imagine, if the pro-life people had all just sort of said like, oh no, the current party system is beyond repair. We're just going to, support the Christian Heritage Party or some new like pro-life party. It would just be even easier to dismiss them. Whereas you see somebody like Aaron O'Toole, even though he is himself pro-choice, he clearly feels the pressure of the pro-life community and has to do something to make some sort of peace with them. In a way, he just doesn't feel the pressure from the more sort of immigration restrictionist or skeptical sort of community, because they are safely now in just this kind of cul-de-sac of the Bernier sort of thing, which seems to be in some sort of death spiral. So it's very easy to just use that and wipe your hands and sort of say, well, that debate is closed.
It's an interesting take. Let's talk a little bit about Aaron O'Toole, because you said that there wasn't really a populist movement within the Conservative leadership race, which I agree, but we do hear some of the sort of rhetoric from Aaron O'Toole. He had a Labor Day message that was very explicitly reaching out to trade unions and maybe people who have been disaffected by the NDP, like you talked about before. So what is your assessment, JJ, of the new Conservative leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as that kind of stuff goes, he is sort of hitting the right notes, I think that in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election in 2016, there was in the conservative intelligentsia on this continent, there was kind of a thinking that the Conservative Party, or that the conservative cause, sort of has to be more pro-worker in some way, has to be more sort of overtly blue-collar friendly, has to be, even more perhaps inclined towards the interests of unionized workers, not public sector unions, but like more private sector sort of unions, and sort of make a greater peace with that. Because there was a sort of thinking that Donald Trump's election was sort of built on the back of this kind of new coalition, which is sort of the more downscale, the less educated people, in contrast to what, both Republican and Conservative Party consultants tend to push, which is this idea that, you have to go after, the suburbs and the urban sort of centers. And that's kind of making yourself palatable to those communities and sort of speaking their language and playing that game. Now, it sort of remains to be seen. Of course, we're filming this just, literally a few days before the U.S. election. It remains to be seen whether or not that coalition is strong enough to carry President Trump to a second term, or whether or not, alienating the suburbs in particular is sort of a too high of a price to pay, and that whether or not, if Trump does lose, then there will be sort of I think a vindication of the more sort of traditional advice, which is that, you do actually have to reach out to suburban and urban voters, and certainly, college educated people, college educated women in particular, and that you can't run too far in the other direction. Like, everything sort of has an equilibrium. But Aaron O'Toole does seem like he has taken a bit from the Trump playbook, in the sense that he does seem to have an interest in sort of carrying himself as the more blue collar friendly, the more overtly pro worker kind of party. And, I think that remains to be seen if that will be effective, obviously. But there is, I think, a possibility for a sort of Trump-style realignment with some aspects of the party system in this country, which is to say that there are, I think, when you look at, say, a big map of Canada, one of these big election color-coded maps, you can see that there are a lot of sort of like large, sort of like rural or semi-rural kind of blue-collar ridings in this country that are currently held by the NDP. And as you were sort of saying earlier, like, the NDP has moved quite far away from its kind of blue-collar working class kind of origins, or even a pretense of being a party for that kind of community, as opposed to being, the kind of the woke party of the academic urban sort of establishment and the big public sector unions. So in that sense, like, there is a possibility where you could imagine that rather than, taking seats from the Liberals in downtown Toronto or Vancouver, that an O'Toole-led party could, in theory, target some of these NDP-held sort of blue-collar ridings, perhaps in northern BC or northern Ontario, or, other sorts of parts of, in Manitoba and places like this. Like, there is some fertile territory. The Maritimes as well could possibly represent some fertile territory too. So I think it's a good strategy. Like, I think that it's worth a shot, and I think that the Conservatives need to have they just need to have a unique strategy. They need to try something different, because I think that the Harper sort of technique has sort of panned out. I think that Andrew Scheer kind of represented just like, what they call like the dead cat bounce, like one last shot at basically trying to rebuild the Harper coalition. And I think that didn't work. And so I think like, yeah, and I think a lot of conservatives are willing to give Aaron O'Toole credit for at least trying something new, at least having a theory of the electorate that strikes as being a little bit fresh, a little bit creative, a little bit innovative, and will hopefully suggest that rather than simply targeting like the big cities and in worst of all Quebec, that they're actually going to try targeting some territory that have been previously written off by conservatives as being inhospitable in the way that the sort of the Trump Republican campaign targeted areas like, Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota and other sort of places like that, Pennsylvania, that were sort of seen as being traditionally, part of the blue wall. And sort of the Trump people said, well, maybe not. Maybe this actually, on sort of like cultural and economic grounds, if we sort of tweak our message a little bit, make it a little bit more overtly pro-worker, maybe a little bit less sort of like globalist, less sort of blindly in favor of things like free trade and open borders and that kind of thing, maybe we can make some gains there. And so, yeah, again, I think it's worth a shot.
I think one of the things that Trump doesn't get enough credit for was how deeply connected he has been with the sort of Rust Belt and blue collar Americans, not even in like a strategic political way that just came out in 2015 or 2016, but, going back, like his entire career, he spent kind of marketing himself and branding himself as almost like an everyman American who just became really rich and really successful. And, everything from his forays into professional wrestling and being involved in all of that to his personal brand selling suits and all that kind of stuff. He built a brand that was recognizable for the sort of people who were sort of left out of the political establishment. So it wasn't just like he swooped on the scene and was like, hey, I want to attract blue collar voters. He had been like cultivating that for years and years. And I don't really see that from Aaron O'Toole. But on the counter, Trump really, really puts off suburban women. Like if you look at the polling numbers, it's pretty stark. Men versus women, especially like you said, college educated women do not like Trump. Whereas I think Aaron O'Toole probably still has a shot with that demographic. But yeah, certainly I think that the strategy is interesting, and it's a little bit refreshing to see something a little bit different. You recently tweeted, JJ, that Doug Ford is the biggest failure and disappointment in Canadian conservative politics. Can you expand on that?
Well, I mean, I think that there was a lot of hope for Doug Ford when he first sort of came onto the scene. I think that there was a hope that he could be a kind of populist. You said that he got reputation for sort of being the Trump of Canada for a brief window of time, and I mean, fair enough. Like, he did support Donald Trump. You can watch clips of him on CBC during the 2016 election in which he was very sort of outspoken and like, I'm going to be pro-Trump, and I'm not afraid to sort of say that. And so I think like that gave people a lot of I suppose a lot of people on the right hope for what this kind of guy was going to represent. I think that the fact that he beat what was her name, Elliott, in the Conservative Party leadership election, Christine Elliott, I think that gave people a lot of hope too, like that Christine Elliott was sort of seen as this, very sort of like establishment political figure, and that for somebody like, Doug Ford, who still sort of had the aura of his brother's very sort of populist outsider administration in Toronto, that sort of like the residual reflected aura of that was sort of projected onto Doug Ford as well. But the problem is that it seems like certainly during the pandemic that Doug Ford has not at all exercised any agency to suggest that he is interested in being anything other than, basically governing as a liberal, like just being in complete hawk to conventional wisdom, really sort of craving the approval of Ottawa, really craving the approval of the mainstream press, not willing to, to just sort of like challenge the conventional wisdom about things like, how strict these lockdowns should be, how long they need to be, how invasive they need to be. And also just like, I think that, I've heard people sort of give him the nickname of like Premier Karen, just in the sense of like how personally like judgy and judgmental and sort of bossy he's been when it comes to like the way he sort of carried himself in his press conferences, and like the lack of empathy that he's shown for people that are on the receiving end of these lockdowns, the business owners that have had to shutter their businesses and the loss of revenue for them and their families and the massive inconvenience it's been towards parents and all of this kind of thing. Like, there's been a sense that Ford has just not really risen to that occasion at all. Like, we're not sort of saying that he needs to go the sort of the full Trump and, be, too extreme in the other direction where he's, rejecting science or whatever, being openly contemptuous of scientific authority or whatever the sort of the stereotype of what Trump has done wrong has been. But there is kind of a sense that that this pandemic has been like ideologically divisive in some ways, and that there has been a sort of like maximalist position on it on the left, which has sort of been in favor of like maximum lockdowns, maximum like erring on the side of maximum cautiousness, like no price is too high to pay for, fighting this pandemic. And then the sort of more conservative disposition, which has been a lot more sort of skeptical, more inclined to sort of challenge the expert opinion, notice that it is sort of changed and morphed over the months, and thus is perhaps not as deserving of the blind deference as some of the other people on the other side have been willing to give it, and sort of say that, that as much as it is important to fight the pandemic and do what it takes to be protected from it, that these sort of things have a cost as well, and that there is a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done, and that it's not a matter of just, having a complete lockdown or complete chaos, complete death and destruction and disease, but there is some sort of like trade-off that you have to be able to make, where you have to say, well, what is an acceptable risk factor that we can have in order to ensure that, the prosperity of our society, the mental health of our society, our ability to continue go on living our normal lives that are necessary to uphold our society can also be continued. And it just seems to a lot of people, and certainly a lot of people on the right, when I sort of see what they're saying and writing about Ford and Ford's administration during the pandemic, they don't think that he's achieved that balance at all. And what's worse is they don't even see him as a person that seems interested in achieving that balance, or even slightly skeptical in the way that you expect a supposed conservative populist to be. Instead, like I said, like he just really does seem like he's courting the approval of the mainstream press and the Liberal government in Ottawa, which just is not the kind of thing that I think people expected that they would be getting when they got Doug Ford in charge. Like, is it possible to really sort of conceptualize how this government is handling things differently than a Premier Wynne government would be? And I don't think the answer to that is obvious at all.
Yeah, it seems very, very top down. Well, JJ, I think a lot of people know you as a YouTube guy. You've got a really popular channel over there. I love your videos. I always learn a lot. I have a Canadian degree in political science, and I still somehow learn things from your videos. But you're also a very serious political commentator, and you have a very serious role over at the Washington Post. Tell us a bit about how you became a columnist for the Washington Post, and why didn't you go the sort of more traditional Canadian route and write for the Vancouver Sun or the National Post or even the Globe and Mail? How did you end up at the Washington Post?
Well, I mean, I think that the Washington Post wanted me, and none of those other places did. I have not been a popular guy with the mainstream press in this country. I mean, I guess people can reach their own conclusions as to why that is. But the Washington Post, they were nice, and they extended an offer to me, and I took it. I mean, I think that they'd read some of my other writing. I've written for a number of other publications over the years in both Canada and the US. Always sort of talking about Canadian issues, but I try to talk about Canadian issues in a sort of, I don't know, in a fresh way. I think I'm a kind of contrary person. And so I do try to like extract myself a bit from these narratives that we've been talking about and try to assess things in a somewhat more objective way, or sort of say like, well, how would an outsider see this? Let's like sort of challenge some of the assumptions that we use to describe how things happen in Canadian politics. And I think that there is a problem that a lot of young journalists in particular don't come at it with that kind of attitude of curiosity and skepticism. Instead, they come at it with an attitude of conformity and, sort of obedience to the narratives and the sort of the standard practices of who is good and bad and what is sort of like the larger story in Canada at any given time. And so I don't know. It's just, the Washington Post people just reached out to me. I've been there for, I think, close to 4 years now. I remember I started there right at the time of the US election. And so I guess we're getting close to the 4-year period. And they've been great to me. They've been very supportive, and my pieces are popular. People read them. And And yeah, so I can't say anything bad about it at all. I've had a great time working there, and I'm like, again, like, I've always been around. The mainstream press in Canada has not been interested in me, and so I suppose at some point you just go with the people that are willing to take you, and so that's why I went with the Post.
Well, I think you still have an outsized influence though, because you're sort of like outside the Laurentian circle. You're out in Vancouver, and you put forth these sort of contrarian but kind of underlying conservative articles, and you just really manage to get under the skin of the mainstream media, which we can see play out on Twitter just about any time you put out a piece. But I want to talk about one specific column that you wrote a couple of weeks ago, really taking Justin Trudeau to town on his throne speech that ostensibly said that he wanted to tackle systemic racism, whereas you juxtapose that with his obsession with bilingualism and pointed to the outcome, which was that he doesn't really elect, or he doesn't appoint anyone to federal courts that isn't basically, an elderly or a middle-aged white person.
Yes.
So I, that was a pretty just visually when, I don't know if it was you or someone over at the Post, but they put together the pictures of all the people that Justin Trudeau had appointed. And it's like, oh, wow. If that was happening in the US, it would be, in your face and everyone would be talking about it, but it happens in Canada. So why don't you walk us through that argument that you made?
Yeah, and it's not just the federal judiciary either. I mean, it's, yes, every single judge on the Supreme Court of Canada, and I think every one but like two judges on the federal court roster is white. But also like I think one or two of like the 30 deputy ministers in this country, who are the people that are actually running the federal government, are all white. Every one, but I think maybe two of the heads of the, I don't know, 30 crown corporations that we have in this country are white. The heads of the armed forces are all white. Like, you can go down the list, and it's just all white people everywhere. And
well, and not just white, but like French Canadian,
well,
right?
that's
Most of
that's
the
the
names
critical
are.
thing. No, it's true, and it's because this is bilingualism. Like, this is the consequence of the bilingual policy that Justin Trudeau believes so heavily in. It's the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act, and Justin Trudeau has made. I mean, this hasn't been that widely reported, but this has been like one of the key sort of priorities of his government. Is that we're going to update and modernize the Official Languages Act in sort of celebration of 50 years of success. And, you might think update and modernize means we're going to be a little bit more conciliatory to the way that Canada is a much more diverse and eclectic linguistic country than it was 50 years ago, when the only dynamic really was between the English Canadians and the French Canadians. Canada was an extraordinarily white country, even within my own lifetime, until immigration and all the rest of that has changed it. And that's fine. That's just the reality of the country that we live in now. But part of that consequence of that is that you have fewer and fewer, if you ever even had that many, but fewer and fewer Canadians who can speak fluent French and English at the level that the federal government requires. And not only requires, but has systematically strengthened in terms of its strictness for the requirement, in order to hold sort of top executive rank jobs in the government of Canada. They call it, I think, section like 91 jobs, but it's basically like any job that Ottawa determines French and English are necessary for the functioning of that purpose. You have to be bilingual, and it's usually bilingual at the time of appointment, which is like a very, very high level of fluency that is expected in order to hold any of these jobs that are overwhelmingly executive rank jobs, and top level jobs as well. And so the problem is that you're really selecting for a skill, a mostly irrelevant skill, I would say, that is not in fact necessary to do a lot of these senior level jobs, but it is a skill that is disproportionately held by a very small ethnocultural group of Canadians, which are mostly French Canadians, or Canadians that are sort of part of a kind of bilingual milieu around mostly Ottawa and Montreal, right? It's something like, I believe it's around 17% of Canadians overall that possess this skill of perfect French-English bilingualism, and something like 90% of that 17, or possibly more, are located in the province of Quebec. So you can't really have a government that says it's committed to having a country that is diverse, and having a government that is reflective of that diversity, and then also champion this very outdated, old-fashioned idea that Canada is fundamentally a country of two founding nations, only two, the French and the English, and that those communities sort of will forever be able to dictate the shape and nature of the country, and that sort of like the only real dominant civil rights issue of Canada is making an environment that is inclusive and is welcoming to unilingual French Canadians, which is to say, like French Canadians who can't speak English at all, which is not that many and increasingly less and less, despite the Quebec government's dogged efforts to ensure that Quebecers don't speak English. More French Canadians speak English than ever before, which means that even the demand that like even the argument that this is somehow like necessary for inclusion or ability to create a functional workplace for unilingual French Canadians is becoming a weaker and weaker argument. So I really view this as one of sort of like the great existential challenges to sort of Canadian liberalism and Canadian progressivism, but also one that's really just not talked about very much because I don't know, it's a weird sort of compartmentalization that somebody like Justin Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh or, you know, any sort of left-wing Canadian of any prominence that you want to name, like their ability to sort of like believe these two deeply contrary goals simultaneously, that we're going to have a very inclusive, welcoming society and government, and at the other hand, like there is nothing more important than speaking not one but two European languages in order to achieve any power or prominence in this country. But you're right, like this is in some respects the ultimate taboo of sort of polite establishment Canadian opinion, Laurentian opinion, and that's why there is nothing I sort of get more of a hard time for than when I say this. And one other thing I would just add is that I always find it like funny and weird that at a time when we're talking about like systemic racism and systemic barriers to entry for, you know, people of color, people of color of lesser means, that like your otherwise perfectly progressive people can turn into these like very sort of cold-hearted meritocrats, right? So like if you're kind of saying like, oh, you know, there's not a lot of people that come from non sort of francophone backgrounds or non you know, Quebec or Eastern Canadian narrow sort of backgrounds in the high levels of our government, you know, a lot of people, including the Prime Minister himself, will turn around and say, well, maybe they're just lazy and they should just, you know, pick up a book sometime and sort of like figure out how to do it. And the only thing that's sort of standing in their way is their own inability to pull themselves up and do what it needs to take. And it's like, not only is that, I think, very ignorant in terms of just what we know about linguistic science and how languages are learned or not learned, which is mostly because you need that language for day-to-day communication, not because some law somewhere says you have to speak it. But, you know, it is also just a kind of argument that would never be considered acceptable in progressive circles anywhere else, right? Like if you sort of were to identify like a wealth inequality between people of color and, you know, white Canadians, for instance, you wouldn't just say, oh, well, it's because they're just not working hard enough, or because, you know, maybe they should just get better jobs if they're so sad about being poor, or things like that, right? It's this like very weird sort of like Dickensian logic that the left in this country will employ only in this one very specific case. Everywhere else, they'll talk a good game about equality and non-judgment and, you know, bringing down systemic barriers and systemic racism, except for this.
Well, it's interesting because, yeah, every now and then there'll be a viral video out of Vancouver of some sort of angry Canadian, you know, shouting at someone, a Chinese immigrant or something, saying like, speak English in Canada or whatever. And, you know, they get like completely bullied and painted as like an evil, malicious person, whereas like that's like the official law in Quebec. Like,
yeah, no, exactly. Well, I mean, it's technically it's the official law federally as well, right? Like, I mean, they do have to speak English, but then they also have to speak French as well. So, I mean, it is like
but I mean, you can't even have a sign in Quebec that isn't in French. So, you know, they can use a hammer to enforce their language. But I want to ask you though, I sometimes wonder with views like this, and I think the reason that the mainstream media sort of resents you, JJ, is because you have this big platform that they can't like, you know, that they can't compete with. You have a huge audience in the US, and, you know, they'll try to pick apart your argument, but, you know, you still have your platform, which is great. But I sort of wonder sometimes if you're making these arguments in tongue in cheek to sort of show the hypocrisy of the Liberals and this sort of two contradictory views that they have, which I think is completely accurate. But do you actually think Canada is a systemically racist country? Because I feel like I've heard you sort of make that argument, or you're sort of underlying, you know, saying that it does exist in Canada. I reject the idea. I don't think that systemic racism is a very clear term, and I don't think that mean, I myself don't concede that is the case in Canada, but I wondered what your position was on systemic racism.
I mean, I think that there are obviously discriminatory barriers that exist. And I think that racism is a thing and that racism can be present in sort of subtle cultural ways, or maybe even not so subtle cultural ways. And that these sorts of attitudes of discrimination can indeed sort of prevent barriers from people of color from sort of climbing as high as they would like to in their personal lives and their professional lives. That being said, like, I certainly don't think that, like, the Canadian government has at its core, like, a kind of conscious desire to maintain white supremacy, which is what some people would argue. Like, I think that, all of the available evidence suggests that this is an issue. The issue of discrimination and racism is something that the Canadian government takes very seriously. I think it took seriously under Stephen Harper. I think you can go back many generations and say that this is something that Canadian governments have always been very sensitive to, that, like, we want to make a more diverse and inclusive society in which Canadians of all backgrounds can thrive and get ahead. Sort of like the argument that I make is this, that I think that barriers to all sorts of Canadians exist in all sorts of levels, not just racial barriers, but, barriers that prevent true diversity from being reflected in our government, in terms of, gender diversity and, class diversity, and of course, ideological diversity, and just the diversity of having a lot of people that come from different backgrounds and different life experiences, and sort of creating a government and a civil service and, all of the other sort of senior institutions of our society that truly do reflect Canada. And I think it's always, like, I come at it from just a very sort of like simplistic democratic logic, which is that, like, in a democratic society, it is very important for the barriers of entry to be as low as possible, that people that want to have a job in their government, that want to be engaged in their government, that want to sort of like be playing a role in making the decisions that affect their lives, that path should be relatively sort of unblocked. It should be relatively simple for an interested, dedicated, determined Canadian to be able to exercise some degree of influence in his government and in his society. And so I think that when the government sort of erects barriers to prevent that from happening, whether or not they are, sort of cultural barriers or like clear legal barriers like these bilingualism requirements, I think that they're things that should be opposed. So I know that when we talk about stuff like systemic racism and that kind of thing, it's become this very sort of like hot and very polarizing kind of issue in which people are sort of thinking about it in this very sort of like, yeah, just one or the other way. It's like either Canada's like a completely racist country that has no redeeming qualities at all. It's just this white supremacist kind of hell state, or, Canada has basically nothing to apologize for at all, and that there's no sort of introspection at all that's necessary. And I kind of reject both of those poles. And I think that, we should just look fairly at these institutions. We should take seriously criticisms that people make. That doesn't mean that you have to this is the problem with the left, is that they just uncritically swallow every argument that is made using this kind of language. So like if they say, I don't like this statue because I think that statue is a symbol of white supremacism, then the left wing just kind of says, well, you're right, we'll tear it down, right? As opposed to, I think that it's possible to hear that argument and sort of say, okay, well, let's have a conversation about that. Let's sort of discuss what are the actual merits here. Does that argument stand up to scrutiny? Can we come to some sort of objective assessment if that's true or not? In some cases, it might be true. I definitely think that there are, some people, for instance, that don't deserve to be commemorated because they were objectively bad people, even by the standards of their time, and contributed very little. But then there are people like, John A. Macdonald, who you could say clearly on the net more positive than negative, and that if there's something sort of morally wrong with trying to eliminate that. So yeah, when it comes to this whole debate, I don't know. I try to be a little bit pragmatic about it, because I do think that that's something that conservatives have to be a little bit sensitive to, and it can be a little bit self-destructive when you're sort of seen as being too immediately dismissive.
Well, I think it's important to define terms, because I feel like you're right. There's definitely nuance to it, and no one's saying that Canada's a perfect country. But the idea that all of a sudden, something happens in the U.S. and then, every Canadian politician has to genuflect and admit that Canada is a systemically racist country without understanding like what that exactly means, because I think a lot of Canadians would just see it as a total attack on our institutions and our traditions. And then, that's the systemic part. And I think it's intentionally vague. Like instead of pointing to a specific policy, which is what you do, to give you credit, you point at specific policies and say, this is what's could be problematic or whatever. They just say, the system is broken. And then the term racism has this underlying implication of intent, malicious intent. And so even what you pointed out in the Washington Post, what you're really talking about is sort of an inequality of outcome, but not necessarily a racist intent that led to that inequality of outcome. And so I think you have to be careful with the term racism, because it did once have that meaning of sort of, malicious race-based intent, whereas now it just sort of means like, that the outcome isn't a perfectly diverse reflection of Canadian society, and then you have to go back and say, okay, well, was that intentional, or was that sort of an unintended consequence, and what are ways that we can, change the unintended consequence? And I think that's part of the problem. Obviously, there's racists in Canada. There's racists in every society. I don't think anyone's denying that. But to say that it's sort of cooked in, that's sort of where my problem lies. As long as we're being clear about what it is that we're talking about. I think you do raise some areas in Canada where there is clearly systemic racism when it comes to the Indian Act. That's an entire system of laws that has been designed to have separate governing functions for one group of people, basically based on their race and ethnicity. So I wanted to have your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I made a video, one of my favorite videos that I've made recently, where I talk about Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the 6 classes of Canadian citizen. This is something that is sort of very long forgotten about, but at the time was considered a real big deal, which is why I made a video about it, which was that when the Charlottetown Accord, this constitutional amendment, package of amendments that was being proposed by the Brian Mulroney government, with the support of basically all of the Canadian establishment, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, former prime minister, came out of retirement, and he gave a very strong and powerful speech in which he was denouncing the idea of Canada getting away from his vision, imperfect as it was. Like, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in theory, had a vision of a sort of Canadian society that was based around a kind of like a civic identity, and an identity of sort of liberal democratic rights for all citizens equally, that all Canadian citizens, and it was sort of manifest by, of course, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was an effort to really sort of like define Canada as a nation that was not defined by race or creed or anything like that, but rather by a kind of concept of civic liberalism, as we would say, an identity of civil rights for all Canadians, regardless of their distinguishing characteristics. And what the Charlottetown Accord sought to do was instead create this idea and sort of say, like, Canada is not, in fact, a country of equal rights for all people, but it is a country of special collective rights based on your identity as part of certain identifiable groups. And that the Charlottetown Accord basically identified 6 of these groups, French Canadians, English Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians, with sort of different distinctions based on where they lived and all the rest of it. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau sort of said, like, that this is fundamentally bad, and this is not the kind of society that we should want to live into, because when you have a society that is determined, that grants rights on the basis of collective identity rather than individual identity, really what you wind up having is just greater tyranny for various forms of government that purport to represent those communities, because nobody represents an individual. An individual like you and me, we're individuals, we're only lobbyists for ourselves, and we can fight for our rights through the court system and all the rest of it, but ultimately, like, the government has to recognize our rights as individuals and sort of leave us unmolested through our ability to exercise our rights as individuals. But when you have a collective right, what this winds up doing is that it creates greater powers for these institutions that purport to represent the collective. And what Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, and I think what we would all agree with, is that, by entrenching rights for French Canadians specifically, well, what this does is it gives more power to the government of Quebec, right? Because it professes to be the government of the French Canadians. And you've sort of seen, certainly under this current government in Quebec, I think it has become quite authoritarian, because it conceptualizes itself as like, we are standing up for the rights of the Francophone Quebecers, and like, that is our duty, and we will run roughshod over the civil rights, the individual rights of anybody who does not conform, including religious minorities and English Canadians. But then, to get to your original point, is that this is also the case when it comes to Indigenous Canadians, right? So despite Pierre Elliott Trudeau's warning, despite the fact that we voted down the Charlottetown Accord, the governments have nevertheless continued to progress in the direction where Indigenous Canadians only have collective rights, which is the idea like as an Indigenous Canadian, your rights are only able to be exercised through your identity into these sort of like culturally ethno sort of distinguished community groups, which then you will exercise those collective powers through that group identity through basically your Indigenous, your Aboriginal government, your Indian Act sort of recognized government, or in some cases, even governments that exist outside of the Indian Act. And sort of as we've seen in British Columbia with some of the recent pipeline controversies, like just some other competing community that professes to be the only legitimate government of that particular sort of ethno-nationalist Indigenous band or tribe or what have you. And the problem with this is that then you get into this business where it's like all of everything that is purported to be a matter of Indigenous rights is really just this kind of government to government negotiation. You have the identified Aboriginal government sort of negotiating with either Ottawa or the provincial government over these very sort of like high level things that usually just descend into granting more rights to that particular government and sort of the particular gang of politicians that are running that Indigenous government. And the rights of the Indigenous Canadians, the individual rights of the Indigenous Canadians sort of get left in the lurch because no one is really advocating for them at that level. You're having these government to government, as Justin Trudeau would say, sort of nation to nation negotiations and discussions, and that is sort of assumed to be a positive end unto itself. And in the rights of the Indigenous people as exist in a kind of individualistic sense, in the sense of like their right to safety, security, the security of the individual, their right to health and happiness and liberty, like all of that kind of stuff gets treated as a much sort of lesser priority than these collective rights, which include government power and also like some of these. Like these things like cultural rights and rights of consultation and all of these kinds of rights that are ultimately just collective rights for government rather than rights for the individual. And you're right, like it does ultimately come down to this question of like, well, where do those rights ultimately derive from? And they ultimately just derive from your identity, not as an individual, but as a kind of member of an ethnocultural nationalist group, which is just so contrary to the idea of what this country is supposed to be. And this is another instance in which I just feel like the left in this country just doesn't really have a good way of compartmentalizing or rationalizing this obvious inconsistency. Because on the one hand, most sort of left-wing progressive Canadians would say, like, yes, we want to live in a kind of equal rights sort of society. We love the Charter of Rights. We love this idea of a country defined by, this kind of one-size-fits-all approach to civil rights. But then on the other hand, they're also like huge enablers of what I would say is a very flawed sort of system and structure for dealing with the rights of Indigenous peoples in this country. This kind of broken Indian Act, nation to nation, government to government based sort of setup. And I don't know really how they are able to rationalize that inconsistency other than to just kind of mask over it with this kind of feel good language of reconciliation and, the guilt over the past and this kind of thing. And just to use that as a way of masking critical questions to be asked as to whether or not this actually is the best way that we can go about doing what they're purporting to care the most about, which is sort of improving the lot of the life of Indigenous people in this country.
Right. Trudeau and his cabinet sort of have a lot of empathy, so it feels like they care. But when it comes to what they actually do, I mean, it's just absolutely full of contradictions. And it seems like, the first Trudeau, it was basically the same. I think that he would have been horrified by the idea of considering Indigenous people as separate nations and doing nation to nation. I mean, it sort of undermines the idea that we're all Canadians and that we all have the same basic individual rights. And interesting to your point about Charlottetown, how it was the Conservatives in Mulroney who were interested in inserting collective rights into a constitution. You kind of think of Conservatives as being the party of individual freedom and individual rights, and it wasn't too long ago that seems like it was sort of the opposite. But one of the things that you had in that video, the 6 types of Canadians, was talking a little bit about how Pierre Trudeau, with his white paper of 1969, originally wanted to just sort of do away with the Indian Act and say, enough with the separate treatment and the reservations and all that kind of stuff. And once they proposed it, it sort of didn't go very well, and then they sort of backed away from it. It doesn't seem like anyone has ever picked up that mantle to try to go down that path again. What do you think the solution is? I mean, I don't think that anyone can look at the state of, the way that so many people in Canada live on reserves and say, okay, these people have the same opportunities and the same quality of life as Canadians who live in cities or Canadians who are not Aboriginal. I mean, obviously there's no simple solution, but what did you think about the 1969 white paper and Trudeau back then? And do you think that there's anything to that we could use today to try to move forward with sort of improving the lot for Aboriginal Canadians?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's definitely like the speeches that Pierre Elliott Trudeau gave and sort of the official government report, the white paper itself. These are all worth reading today because they're just windows into a very different logic than anything you hear present now. And the white paper has been sort of imagined as this like statement of cultural genocide. When I was in university, my university actually stopped using the phrase white paper to refer to internal government or internal sort of bureaucratic documents because it was taken for granted that that term had been so like infused with the negative energy of the 1969 sort of initiative that it should never be spoken of again. But it's like when you go back and you read what was actually contained in the white paper and you read what Pierre Elliott Trudeau was arguing, it is an extraordinarily like compassionate and empathetic sort of mentality. And I don't, that should not be a controversial thing to say. Like, I would hate if anybody like would try to cancel someone over sort of suggesting that, because it is clear. Like, you can say, and I know that like a lot of people would say that, maybe it was naive, maybe it was short-sighted, maybe it was based on an assumption that, is now discredited by contemporary theories or what have you. But it was nevertheless like, it was a clear argument. The argument was that, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau said this explicitly, is that you cannot have equality in a society that perpetually defines one class of person as being the other. And particularly, you cannot have a society, and he said this very explicitly as well, is that you cannot have like a society in which one part of the society has a treaty relationship with another part of the society. Like, that is just a fundamentally unequal relationship. It puts forever one class of the society in a subordinate position to the other, and it creates this relationship of codependence and and paternalism that is just not healthy for either. And Trudeau was very explicit about saying this, and it's kind of like there has never really been that I've seen a very persuasive rebuttal of some of the points that he made at that level, right? In this sort of sense, like, well, if you sort of take the abstract view of this, like if you sort of divorce it from all of like our emotional feelings about this issue as it exists in contemporary Canada, if you just kind of like think about like, if we were starting from scratch, how would we sort of set up a society in which we had an aggrieved minority in that way? Would we sort of set up a sort of elaborate architecture of separate rights and sort of treaty rights and creating this category of like status Indian as a completely different sort of status of person, and having all of your individual rights not only subordinate to that legal class of person, but then sort of further subordinating that to your band's government and your band government's ability to sort of represent you on behalf of you at that level in negotiation with the federal government, and working its way through legal challenges and court cases and all the rest of it. It just seems like, as much as anything else, a terribly inefficient and ineffective system for yielding the kind of results that we should all want, which is, to say for Aboriginal Canadians to live free and prosperous, happy, satisfied, independent lives like the rest of us have, in theory. So I don't know, but the problem is now is that sort of since that sort of white paper approach was introduced, Trudeau backed away from it, in part because a lot of the Aboriginal governments themselves opposed it because, in theory, they had the most to lose. And you can also say, like, fine, maybe Trudeau was insensitive in the way that he went about doing it. We, of course, now live in a time in which we believe that, consultation is sort of like the most fundamental way to establish any sort of just idea in government. And, perhaps that argument can be made. But anyway, the point is that in some respects, this debate is entirely sort of academic, because when you go in the years since then, Pierre Elliott Trudeau himself enshrined treaty rights into the Constitution of Canada. That was since further strengthened by a constitutional amendment, making Aboriginal treaty rights even more entrenched in the Constitution, to the point where they have literally like the status of constitutional law. So this kind of stuff can't really be unspooled from the Canadian system in the way that it could in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's time, which was sort of in 1969, Canada was a much different country than it is now. Our constitution was a lot more malleable. You could dream sort of big ideas in a way that you just can't now, because we're so codified or so sort of cornered in by our constitution and by Supreme Court precedent and all of this kind of thing. But so I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer in terms of like, do we have the capacity to imagine a different reality? Do we have the capacity to imagine a setup for Aboriginal Canadians in this country that is different than the Indian Act regime, that is different than this kind of treaty-based, Indian Reserve-based regime? Do we have the capacity, or are we just so sort of boxed in with the laws and the precedents and the court rulings and whatnot, and the bureaucracy and all the rest of it, that this kind of stuff really can't be conceptualized in any other way, and we're just kind of forced to deal with it? I don't know. I mean, that sounds like a sort of fatalistic sort of argument to make, and I also want to be clear that like I'm not attempting to make the argument that that some sort of like super ultra heavy-handed assimilationist agenda is the desirable one either, because I think that this is not a sort of binary thing. I think that though that the question has to be, and I think I would like to see conservatives try to think bigger ideas about this and try to think like, if we had to start from scratch, what would we do in order to ensure that the rights of all Canadians, including Indigenous Canadians, can be sort of most ably sort of taken care of? And I just don't see any interest in thinking those kind of big questions anymore. I just see so much interest in just, continuing to pretend like the status quo is more sustainable than it is, and that it just, this is sort of like the line that the NDP uses all the time, right? Like, it's just like, if we just had the right people in charge, if we just had the right people in charge of the federal government, if we just had the right prime minister, if we just had the right bureaucrats, if we just had more good faith consultation, if we just believed in the reconciliation agenda more, then somehow all of this elaborate artifice that has been in existence since the 19th century would somehow function in a way it hasn't functioned for the last 200 years or so. And I just think like that's a fallacy, and nothing is ever going to improve. So my call is just for more big thinking and more creative thinking. And obviously this is something as well that, this is not going to be done by just some wise paternalistic white people coming up with some good ideas and telling the Aboriginals to get in line. I mean, obviously that model is wrong as well. And so this is something that, the Indigenous Canadians have to sort of think critically about as well. And they have to look at the status quo, and they have to be willing to honestly ask themselves and to question their leaders, and to wonder, to dare to imagine a better future than what they have now, and to speak explicitly about what that better future would look like, rather than continuing to just hide behind, sort of vague catch-all terms like reconciliation.
Yeah, it's so true that on the left, the mantra is all we have to do is like care more and put ourselves in charge. And on the right, it's sad that there just seems to be so many political issues that have become sort of like third rail issues that is better to just ignore than to even talk about, because you don't want to step on a rake or say the wrong thing. And that's sort of where we are, it seems, with this issue. Although I do wonder, JJ, if you were to just, put it directly to the people, like if there were a referendum for, status Indians or status, I don't even know what the politically correct term is now, but what they would want for their future governance, if they're happy with the status quo, or if they would want something entirely different. And just on the point of consultations, we started this conversation talking about how the House of Commons and question period is all just sort of robotic and very meaningless. I've been to consultations with government, and I feel like it's really just like group therapy. It's an opportunity for people to just say how they feel. Yes. And then it's like, okay, and no one changes their mind and no one changes their opinion. And then they just, say, okay, well, we've consulted them, and then kind of wipe their hands of any responsibility. Well, JJ, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I think we've touched on a very wide range of issues. And yeah. I sat down with you last year and we talked about a bunch of different issues too. So it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great.